In our last video, we talked about the big 6 ideas from the United States Constitution. Once you have gone through all of those notes, I would like you to pick 2 that you think are the most important, explain why you believe each is important or more important than the others, and there should be 1 paragraph, so 5 or more sentences for each of those. So 2 paragraphs, 5 or more sentences apiece, describing what you think are the 2 most significant big ideas of the Constitution. Please make sure you turn it in. So we're going to talk about the different branches of government in a little bit more detail today. We've already looked a little bit at the legislative branch, but now let's take a look at the executive branch, or the President's office. Now, the President's office is organized into a cabinet. You can see here a list of some of the cabinet positions that we have, so that each cabinet member can focus all of their energy on these really important but often very different elements of American life: agriculture, education, commerce, housing and urban development, veterans affairs. These are all individual cabinets within the executive branch. There are a couple particularly important powers that the executive branch has. The President has the veto power. They do have the power to veto bills that come from Congress. They also have the power to write executive orders. Now, we find information about these branches of government in the Constitution, of course. The legislative branch is described in Article 1 of the Constitution. In Article 1, Section 8, there's a list of what are referred to as enumerated powers. And these are powers that are granted specifically to the government, powers that are reserved for Congress in particular in many cases. So Congress has the power to establish currency, to impose and collect taxes. If you think back to the Articles of Confederation, a lot of the failures of the articles are addressed here in Article 1, Section 8, giving specific powers to branches of the federal government. The legislative branch runs by committee, and you can see here lists of standing committees. So this doesn't include special committees, but just standing committees that exist in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. And they concentrate on specific, kind of often niche interest issues that need to be addressed by specific pieces of legislation. So members of Congress often serve on multiple committees. They will often write initial drafts of bills before they are proposed, before they go through the approval process. Think about which one you might be interested in. This is a really great graphic to explain the legislative process. So initially, we have the introduction and referral of bills. Those bills go into committee. Those committees have to schedule presentation of those bills. Bills are presented on the floor of the House, the floor of the Senate. There is then any executive business addressed in the Senate. Sometimes they will come to a joint resolution between the 2 houses. The President has to sign off on the law, has to be prepared to enforce the law, and that bill then becomes a public law. Now, not all laws have an indefinite period of time in which they are applicable. Most bills are presented with a certain lifespan, and they can either be re-upped at the end of that lifespan, or they can disappear. Maybe they become antiquated, or they're replaced with something better. So back to the executive branch, we looked a little bit at cabinet positions in our warm-up earlier. These are all laid out in Article 2. Now, not all the names of the cabinet positions were given when the Constitution was originally written. That's really up to the judgment of the executive branch, but the role and responsibility of the executive branch is in Article 2. The judicial branch is a really fascinating but much seemingly smaller, not necessarily smaller, branch of government. So the role of the judicial branch is to interpret the laws and to ultimately assess the legality of actions taken by private citizens, by the government, and to determine the constitutionality of laws that are passed. This chart is by no means something that you need to have memorized, and you'll notice I'm going to move this screen grab around a little bit so you can see it all starts here with a crime, and then this is the sequence of events through which someone could be processed in the criminal justice system. So this isn't even just like civil court, this is criminal court, and you can see how complex and how detailed this system is. So even though it often seems as though the judicial system is the smaller branch, there are layers upon layers of judicial branch offices and people who serve in those roles all around the country at the local, state, and federal levels. So to give you a sense of how those look, here in this graphic, you can see the different, you can see the hierarchy of the judicial system. So county courts are the lowest courts, those are those local courts, circuit courts, district courts of appeal, and the Supreme Court, and they all have individual responsibilities. Some are shared, but most are delegated to each individual tier in this system. So what I would like you to do, and this is an assignment that I'd like you to turn in, is to read over this chart, read about the individual responsibilities of the different layers of the judicial system, and come up with a 10-question quiz about the judicial branch. 10 questions on the front, 10 answers on the back. The judicial system obviously did not start out nearly as complex as it looks here on these two pictures, but the role that the judicial system plays was really defined by its first Supreme Court Chief Justice, and that is John Marshall. And this is a marker here, this historic marker you can actually see in Fauquier County, Virginia. That's where John Marshall was born. And he's important because he sets a precedent for how the judicial system will function, both that it will function very independently of the other branches, that checks and balances are in place, and he also sets a precedent for what we call judicial review, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, the word precedent is critical when we talk about the role that the judicial system plays. If you know the prefix PRE, it of course means coming before. A precedent is essentially a law that is put in place for other laws to follow after it. So oftentimes, judges will rule in favor of precedent. They'll rule based on decisions that have been made before. There are many cases that come through the Supreme Court while John Marshall is its Chief Justice, but there are a few that are particularly significant as far as shaping the role that the judicial system will play. And the first, and arguably most important, is Marbury versus Madison. So this is a case that takes place in 1800, and we'll talk more about this election in detail once we get into our individual presidents and their stories. But in the year 1800, John Adams has just lost his re-election campaign against Thomas Jefferson. And in that period between when Adams loses the election and Jefferson takes office, that's called the lame duck period. And Adams, very quickly, knowing that Jefferson is of a different political party, decides that he's going to appoint as many judges as he can who sort of favor him politically. So he writes all these letters commissioning new local judges, and he has them sent out, but they don't all make it to the people who are being given these new jobs as local judges. On March 5th, 1801, Thomas Jefferson takes office, and a man named James Marbury, who had been appointed to a judgeship by John Adams, never receives that letter of commission. So he petitions Secretary of State James Madison, and he says, "I was appointed to be a judge. I never received my letter of commission. Thomas Jefferson is denying me the job that I was hired to do by John Adams." And Marshall is asked to weigh in. And initially he says, well, Marbury was legally appointed. The executive branch cannot step foot over the role of the judicial system. However, Marshall knew that there was nothing in the Constitution that said that the Supreme Court could jump in and take what we call original jurisdiction away from the state of Virginia, from where that initial appointee should have received his commission. So Marshall says he cannot grant Marbury his job and uphold the Constitution, because if he did that, he would effectively be doing a job of the executive branch and of the judicial branch. So the court rules in favor of Madison. And this defines what we refer to as judicial review. The idea that the job of the court is not to step in and fulfill the roles that other branches of government may or may not have a responsibility to fill. The role is simply to assess what is constitutional and what is not allowed by the Constitution, and rule accordingly. So this is judicial review. Another significant case that was tried by the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Marshall was McCulloch versus Maryland. So the Bank of the United States was established in the late 1700s, and it's opening different branches around the country. But some individual states did not want that federal bank. They wanted their own local state banks. So the state of Maryland tries to fight back against the Bank of the United States and passes a state law, so it would only apply in Maryland, that they would tax any out-of-state bank because they considered the federal bank to be out of state. But the Bank of the United States refuses to pay that law, saying, well, we're not a different state, we're the federal government, our laws supersede yours. And so Maryland says, no, we want our money, and they sue the debt collector, James McCulloch. Now, what's very unusual is that what's not unusual is that the state of Maryland, when this goes to trial, the state of Maryland rules in favor of the state of Maryland because they wanted to uphold what they believed was their right to impose taxes on a bank that was not a Maryland bank. So James McCulloch, who's facing this massive lawsuit, turns to the he appeals so that the case will get sent up to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the reason that there is jurisdiction there is because we're crossing state lines. The Bank of the United States is a federal bank. Maryland is its own entity. So once you cross those lines, you can go and appeal to the Supreme Court. Now, the court rules in favor of McCulloch, saying he did in fact have the right to collect that debt because the Bank of the United States and the federal bank oversees the state banks, and the state banks cannot tax the federal government. We refer to these powers, this power of the federal government to tax the states, but not the other way around, as implied powers. This is a power that is implied, it is implicitly given to the federal government. So the last trial we're going to talk about on this video is Gibbons versus Ogden. Aaron Ogden and Thomas Gibbons were steamship operators. They operated ferries that crossed the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey. So right off the bat, we have interstate trade across boundaries. The state of New York gave Ogden permission to use that waterway, but the state of New York doesn't have power to give somebody from New Jersey control over that waterway. And Gibbons sues, and he argues that he has just as much right and that New York cannot regulate trade that's happening in another state. New York, of course, sides in favor of Ogden, but Gibbons appeals to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says that, in fact, the state of New York cannot determine who may or may not operate in interstate spaces, which in this case was that waterway between the two states. So these are enumerated powers, powers that are listed as belonging to the federal government, that power to regulate interstate trade. Next class, you will have an open note quiz on the Marshall Court. I'm going to give you a big, gigantic note card that you can use to fill in as much information as you can to use for your quiz.